when you're thinking about it. So coming out of the standard, and I do hope, most people here at least know, coming out of the standard, we have four main pillars. Readers get what they need. Readers can find what they need. Readers can understand what they need, and readers can use what they find to meet their needs. So those are the four pillars of plain language as articulated in the standard, and hopefully you can see they really come like really directly from that definition. So when we're looking at readers get what they need, the key concept here, what the principles actually called is relevance. Is the content you're producing relevant? Because plain language in this way is not just about style. It's not about the how you're communicating. It's also about the what you're communicating. It's a really important thing, because if you're writing in a beautiful way, but you're leaving out half the information that the customer actually needs to make an informed decision, then it's not plain language. You need to be saying the right thing, also in the right way, but you need to be saying the right thing. So what you have to think about when you're thinking about this concept of relevance, some of the things you have to think about is how will your organization consider things like the impact of literacy and numeracy levels. Now, I know quite a few people in this room have heard me before, so I'm not going to do my whole thing about literacy levels are really misleading. Please don't go and think about, everybody in the UK can read as well as a 10-year-old or whatever it's said. It's really misleading. Our literacy levels go up and down every day and every year, and according to how stressed we are, and according to the disabilities we have at that particular time. But we do need to think of literacy and numeracy levels. But often in the old world, people would stop there. And I kind of think there's so many more, what I think are actually more important things. But that's one thing, impact of literacy and numeracy levels. We also need to think about what is ethical and what is honest, because the plain language standard about relevance is very much got an ethical dimension. Are you actually telling the truth? So, are you actually not being misleading? That's really an important part of the definition. So we need to think about that. What organizationally does an organization need to ensure that? Motivations and attitudinal factors. So if you want to read something, how people read and understand. One of the things I look at a lot is if we often have a model of a lone person sitting with a document reading, but often in the real world that's not the case, and we might read with somebody, we might ask somebody to translate something, we might, often it's a little more of a shared, a little more complex picture. So how people read and understand. Whether you're enabling, as an organization, enabling people to not only understand but act on what they have learned from that communication. And then my particular interest at this point is very much around cultural relevance. So how do you make something culturally relevant? How does your organization think about language and language culture? So language gets its power because it's defined relative to frames, prototypes, metaphors, narratives, images, and emotions. So how do we start thinking about whether a piece of communication is made relevant, and if we use the wrong I'm still sharing my screen, right? Yes. If we use the wrong metaphor, what will happen? And I'll show you some examples of things that I like looking at. So I look at because I work on legal and financial content, and often I'm thinking of things like, is the wording we use having an undesirable effect? So for instance, the one thing that I think about a lot is the way investment risk or insurance risk is thought of. It's sort of as a threat, right? And this is why a lot of people don't like having high risk investments, because it's a threat. Whereas high risk investment is perfectly appropriate. It depends on time. It depends on how long your investment needs to go on for. So you wouldn't have a high risk investment if you're going to retire within the next 5 years. But if you're at the start of your career, that's actually quite an important thing to know and think about. So these sort of hidden metaphors or frames that we use are also actually important to think about. How is your organization set up to do this? Or are you just looking at literacy levels and going with that? These issues are a very important part of relevance as well. This is my thought. right now, this, well, you'll look at what you think the standard says, but it doesn't particularly mention this. But to me, if one's talking about relevance, you actually need to broaden your understanding beyond just literacy levels or motivation. So that's the relevance principles. There's three other principles we look at. We look at, is the content findable? And here I think when you'd go into the standard and you'd see what it says about information architecture, about layering and so on. But from the organizational point of view, I think you'd have to ask yourself, what should an organization do to enable good information architecture and design? What impact does AI have if you know your reader is actually going to be accessing that information through a large language model? What impact will that have on the way you think about findability? Understandability. So what should an organization do to ensure we use our clear syntax, our familiar words? The understandable bit is the bit that I think a lot of people are starting to use language models for quite a lot. And so that's an interesting thing of, well, is that appropriate for your organization to automate some of that kind of principle? And that's a really valid question, I think, to ask. The fourth principle is readers must be able to use the information. So that fourth principle is all about co-creation. It's all about monitoring and evaluation. So how should organizations have to evaluate documents and the reader's use of them? So, when you think about all these principles from an organizational point of view, you're thinking about processes. So you're thinking of going from understanding to our design phase, designing for findability, for understandability, and then going to a kind of monitoring and evaluation phase. This kind of process has a lot in common with the kind of consumer understanding world, but to me, it is kind of implicit, not explicit, but implicit within the standard. On the right-hand side is how we at narratology train and develop organizational capacity for these standards. So I don't use a cycle model, I use a tree model because I think it's always reinventing itself and growing and changing as we're going. So you build on a base of usability knowledge, of research and monitoring, evaluation, you get your reader insights, and then you start your design phase and making sure your users can find what information they want and understand.